Richard Westman, who's a senator, and he's on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Mitzi Johnson is on House Appropriations. Carolyn Branagan is on House Ways and Means. Kate Webb is on Fish and Wildlife. She's also a rep. David Zuckerman is a senator, and he's on the Agriculture Committee. Dick McCormick is a senator also, and he's on the Education Committee. And then we have Representative Tony Klein. He's on Energy. And last but not least, Representative Mike Fisher on the end. He's head of House Health Care. So, our esteemed panel. So, the first question is for really, I'm going to start with you, Mitzi, because as Richard says, the budget starts in the House.
Hey.
So when you get the duck call, you'll know that your time's up. What do you
want 3 minutes per question? You want me to leave some time for Rich to also?
No, you get a full 3 minutes if you
okay.
want it, but if you're done before then,
okay.
That's just fine.
Unfortunately for you all, I can ramble forever about the budget.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Just don't throw too many numbers at us. What's the best way to permanently close the budget? Should the state cut programs, implement results-based budgeting, raise taxes, expand the lottery? Should the state continue the motel program for homeless people? Will lawmakers revisit the Reach Up program this year? Lots of questions, really part of one big question, which is how are we going to manage it this year with 70 million or more in a gap?
So can people hear me in the back?
There's a microphone.
That supposedly picks it up.
Yeah, I got it.
You do have to bring it.
I think it should.
Okay.
Good,
All right.
there you go.
We're streaming on the internet. So.
Okay. So every year there are projections made about if we continue, if nothing changes, and we continue current spending and trends, and if we make no changes in revenue, that's her department, not mine, and we look at what revenues will be, we see a difference between if no changes are made, spending and revenues. That's the $70 million gap that Ann refers to. So every year in the budget process, we make changes to either of those lines or both, and to bring the budget into balance. Vermont has always presented a balanced budget, and we will again this year. There are a number of pressures on the budget, issues with the Veterans Home, with Human Services, with teachers' retirement. There are a whole slew of pressures that we see. I think we will be taking a good look at which programs are most effective for Vermonters. We want to make sure that we are spending your tax money in the most appropriate way to meet needs around the state, whether those be needs for job creation and road maintenance, or education funding, or whatever services we may bring to clean water or low-income families. The list goes on. I think the key point that Ann made is in performance-based budgeting, we are really shifting the way we do budgeting, and this year have a solid handful of areas of state government that are going to come to us with their budget request, and instead of just talking about how much money they spend and what they do, they're going to be talking about what the results are. How does that matter to your life and your life and your life for that money having been spent? And so I think that information then gives us a better framework to say where do we best spend your money. So I think that will allow us to have a better idea of which programs need to stay, which perhaps need to be expanded, and which need to be revamped or cut back.
Thank you. That's perfect.
So I think, back up just a little bit. The House has already been dealing with the budget adjustment. And so the Senate won't deal with that until January comes and we get it. So naturally, they have started first. I think it is good for us to talk a little bit about how we got here. We got the federal stimulus money, and through most of the years that we got federal stimulus money during the last recession, we increased our spending by at least 3.6% on average every year. And the last 2 years, we've used one-time monies to get ourselves to balance our budget. The shortfall, according to joint fiscal in the 2012 budget, we used about 176 million was the shortfall. Last year was our 2013 50 million, 2014 67 million. This will be the first year that we run out of surplus, so we really have to think about how we're doing this differently. And I think both the administration first and House Appropriations are talking about using results-based accounting, and it's a tool where they first go, how much did we do, how well did we do this, is anyone better off? So they're asking those questions, so they're looking and starting from a different point on what the reference questions are. This is not going to be easy. I think coming from Lamoille County, I've been on a number of panels with a speaker who says he doesn't want any broad-based taxes. The governor says no broad-based taxes. So I think you'll see a lot of really hard decisions, and I can see large items like the Pay Act, investment in IT projects. I can see us underfunding those. I can see with this new broad-based, results-based accounting that you'll see programs folded into each other. I think all of those things will happen in this year and will make it a very difficult year to get through, particularly because we don't have any of the surplus money. And I think most of that surplus money will be used to solve the budget adjustment before we move into next year.
Thank you. You guys are doing so well with the timing. No duck quacking. This is great.
Wow.
I love it.
Can I just mention, I think it would be helpful for all of the panelists to know that, or be reminded that our mouths have to be like an inch from the mic for it to work through that for people to hear. So as we turn our heads past the mic, it doesn't always pick us up.
Good point, David. Thank you. So the next question has to do with the revenue side of the equation. So I'm going to ask Carolyn, who's on House Ways and Means, to talk to us about whether or not there's going to be any appetite this year for property tax reform, for eliminating some tax expenditures, and whether or not current use is going to be examined this year. We have a reader who submitted a question about current use, and he's asking whether or not the current use program is going to continue given the budget gap. He says that current use is worth about $57 million a year and their budget gap is 75. Is it realistic to keep this program going, basically? So, Carolyn, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. And I will also want to thank everyone for coming here. I think as I look out among people who are here, I know about half of you, and I don't know about half of you, but I'm very glad to have such a good group turn out. So you'd think that the revenue committees would be arguing with the Appropriations Committee all the time because we're the opposite sides of the coin. But actually we communicate really well, and we try to solve our problems before we get to the floor. This year, however, as the previous two speakers have mentioned, it's going to be very, very hard. We've been solving our problems in the last couple of years with money, one-time money. That's gone. Most of our rainy day funds are not available anymore, and we are down to the bottom floor here, and there's not much dust left. So it's going to be a really difficult year as Ways and Means Committee looks at the at the picture, I've been on that committee for 10 years. In the legislature for 12, but on that committee for 10 years. So I've seen all kinds of things. As we look across at how revenue is coming in to the state, we think of equity and we think of fairness. What taxpayers are paying in most to state revenue, who isn't paying in anything, and is that fair to everybody across the state? We have those discussions nearly every day. You asked about property tax. Some of you remember Bud Otterman, who was in the legislature several years ago. He passed away now. I think he lived in Topsom, over in that part of Orange County anyway. But he had an idea to change the way we configure our school taxes so that it would be mainly an income tax. That idea has come around again. Now, you all remember that we have a statewide property tax, and all of that money goes to pay for our public schools. There are other sources of income for our public schools, but most of it comes from property tax. So that's called your homestead tax. And in Vermont, you have two ways to pay your homestead tax. You can pay it on income, or you can pay it on the value of your property. Most Vermonters pay on their income. They get income sensitivity money back from the state, and actually somebody has to put that money up front in order for other people to get it back. So it's a very expensive program to run. So Bud Otterman had some ideas gelling in his head while he was here in the State House. Jim Condon in the last couple of years has been on our committee. He of course represents part of Colchester. He's taken up that idea and come up with a plan that, you're not keeping track of the time, are you? He's come up with
a little extra.
Oh, good. Plan that uses the Bud Otterman plan, but it's a two-part thing. Part of it's based on income and part on the value of your property. Jim Condon's plan would be that the property value would be about 30 cents, maybe 50 cents, somewhere in there, much less than the current state average, which is around $1.20. And then income tax would be based obviously on your income. So the more your income, the higher you pay, the more you pay. So there, I think there will be a lot of discussion on that. I can't read my own writing. Current use. The short answer is I don't think there's going to be change in the current use. Certainly not for people who are already in current use and want to stay there. I represent the town of Georgia up in Franklin County, large agricultural area. Tons of people in Franklin County are on current use because they do dairy farming, goat farming, maple. And those people are worried about a change in current use, obviously. There are farmers everywhere across the state are hanging on by their fingernails. And if you take them off current use, their situation is going to get much more complicated. I don't think that the regulations will change at all for people already in. In fact, when the current use discussion was in the, is that duck? Do I really have to stop? I just did the good part.
You can just finish it quickly, yeah.
Okay.
It better be a duck.
So I'll give it to Rich.
Sorry, I was hoping the duck call wouldn't be too obnoxious.
So let me start with current use. I think I'm on the committee that was appointed in the Senate that has the chair of the Finance Committee, the chair of the Ag Committee, and Natural Resources, and we're all together on this committee looking at current use. We've had 4 meetings. I think there's no one in the Senate that has a mind to dismantle current use at all. We do see some problems in the program. We've heard that there aren't enough county foresters to review plans. Ag land is not reviewed, in the plan for ag land is not reviewed, which causes some concern. We've heard some about the breakup in large lots becoming smaller, which makes it more expensive for the program. And we've heard that appraisals between communities are wildly different. We have heard about two communities right next door to each other with property on the town line in basically an agricultural area, and the appraisals by listers being 3 times more in one community than the community right next door. So those are all things I think we're going to look at. I would say that I think when you talk about education and education finance, then you have to go back a little bit to the tax letter from that the Commissioner of Taxes just put out, and calling for a 5-cent increase in the statewide property tax. You know, because of the process the way it is, I don't think the legislature has any ability to avoid raising the statewide property tax this year, because anything we do would take 18 months to 2 years to change the system around that. So unless we had general fund to put in, we probably can't change that. And I think in the letter from the tax commissioner, they called for a symposium to look at some of the issues around the present formula, because it's been in place quite a long time. And some of the things they talk about are related to the spending in our local communities versus the revenue that we have to raise around it, and there's whole issues. And I encourage anybody to read the letter from the commissioner.
Great, thank you. I think David wants to weigh in.
Well, I just wanted to say one quick thing about the letter from the commissioner. And historically, this has been a letter that every year generates a lot of press, and it's, oh, the administration is going to raise or lower taxes based on the year. And really, this is a letter that is required by our education law based on just the straight raw numbers of property values. And so whether to benefit or not benefit an administration, it's really not a political decision by an administration to put this figure out there. This is just the hard facts of the numbers. And I think Senator Westman basically addressed that in the fact that changing that is a matter of changing our law, not necessarily just a decision by someone in the administration.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Just quickly on that, the numbers aren't really all that hard, because you're basing this on the projected budgets of schools that haven't even been voted on yet. So this is not. We've seen those numbers not work in the past. So that's another complication. And the rolling 3-year average. We may be coming out of the recession, but we're still our property values did increase.
Can I just have that? I just want to make 2 points. One is, in that letter, the commissioner suggested that we lower the amount of money that we give to schools per pupil by, it was something like $300 or $400. I can't remember the exact amount. I think that will be problematic for schools. On the other side of that question, don't forget that we have the statewide tax rate. 1 penny raises about $11 million statewide. We have nearly $11 million in the bank saved from last year's budget. We had that left over as cash on hand. So we had that money available, so we could essentially lower 1 penny right there. And there are other things we can do as far as changing the amount of money schools get per student. You'll recall there were 2 or 3 years in a row where we left the amount of money the state gives for each pupil the same, and that helped lower the tax rate. So there are some things we can do, but I think essentially Rich is correct. It's going to be a tough year for school budgets.
Great. Well, let's tackle the next question. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this issue? Okay. So why don't we just go straight into education, since we started to veer there, Peter and Dick. I guess, Peter, you can start. Well, there are lots of questions, but maybe the first one here is, will the small school grants continue? Will there be an attempt to constrain school spending or shift some of the K-12 spending to pre-K and higher ed? How's consolidation going? Lots of questions here. What reforms to the state's teacher pension can we expect? And are we going to make it more difficult for public school districts to become private? Lots of questions. I can remind you too, because
Yeah.
there are a lot there.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I'll start with small school grants. First, was H 438 last year, coming from House and Means late in the session.
Ways and Means.
Yeah, Ways and Means proposed eliminating small school grants along with decreasing the amount for the threshold, excess spending threshold and whatnot. We did approve the excess spending threshold reduction from 125% above the base education rate to 123, and then thereafter 121. We did not approve the small school grants. Small school grants amount to about $7 million. For some small schools, it was very critical. This all goes back to Act 60 in terms of when that was formed and trying to protect small schools and whatnot. It's an ongoing issue. Act 153, the volunteer merger bill, considered this. We're creating incentives for schools to merge. Why are we subsidizing their small schools at the same time? Was an issue that came up. I imagine it will come back up this year. What else?
How about the teacher pension system?
Well, I'd pass that off to Ways and Means, but
Okay.
you know, it's the teacher pension issue is particularly about the healthcare insurance costs, which are coming out of the corpus of the pension fund, and it's not being properly funded. So you probably have the numbers on that, Rich, but it's a serious amount of money that we've got to address, and the Treasurer Beth Pierce has really been on this, urging us to take action on this.
Do you want to talk about consolidation, how it's going?
Well, consolidation, the volunteer merger bill that was passed about 3 years ago, one district down south in the Rutland-Bennington area, 3 SUs merged to 2, and towns and districts merged into what would become a red or a unified union district. I don't think the money that was proposed to be saved was as much as expected. There have been at least 3 or 4 very close votes. The way that the voting process goes is that all the districts have to approve these mergers for them to be approved, finally approved. If one district votes against it, it all goes down. That's been an issue. But there's a lot, you know, as the economy has worsened and the constraints and pressure on local boards has increased, there is a lot of discussion on these, and I would expect to see some movement on that. On the broader picture, in terms of consolidation, I think this will return in terms of what are the cost drivers. The primary cost drivers, of course, are salaries, personnel.
Sorry.
And this is, I think this would be an issue that will come back, and certainly in the House Education Committee, that will be something we'll definitely be looking at this year.
So maybe I'll pass it off to Dick now, and then if, after that, maybe the 2 of you could also talk about private schools and whether or not we're going to make it more difficult for public districts to become private. But that's after we listen to Dick talk about money, consolidation, all those good things.
We do have this situation on the education committees that after we get done with our deliberations and our wisdom, then it goes to the money committees. And really the decisions are up to them. So education funding is largely out of the control of the education committee. But I will make a couple of points just to remind people. When we talk about teachers' pensions and the inadequate funding of the teachers' pension fund, which has happened at times, it's not the teacher, at least theoretically, it's not teachers' pensions that are vulnerable. It's future taxpayers, because those pensions are a contractual obligation on the part of the state. The danger is not that the teachers are going to be brought up short on their pensions. The danger is that in order to honor the obligation, taxpayers are going to get hit in the future for what should have been funded previously for, and investing. I will get right away, if you don't mind, to the private school
Sure.
issue.
Go for it.
And I think the discussion has been focused too much on private schools versus public schools. I think the focus needs to be on public dollars. The kinds of, the question, our committee in the Senate is considering, for example, legislation that would require that if a private school is drawing public money, that they gotta live by the same rules that the public schools do. And I don't think it's a matter of what rules we put on the public schools, what rules we put on the private schools, it's that these are public dollars. And so there is a way of looking at this to which I subscribe. I don't know if the majority of my colleagues will or will not, but it is that if it's public dollars, we the people, the taxpayers, have a right to say, if you want our money, these are the conditions for getting it. And that the conditions be the same for everybody who's drawing public dollars. There has been legislation to simply prohibit a public school becoming private. That came from Representative Donovan, the chair of the House Education Committee. And I believe that's what resulted in the second study, report. That discussion in the House resulted in that. I have not read the Villasecca report or the, how was it described, the scathing rebuttal, but I'm aware of both and will have certainly read them by the time that we convene. But the idea, I think, is that frankly, there is a movement to seriously undermine public education in this country. That might not be people's motive, but that would be the predictable impact of the so-called school choice. And I think that's going to be a priority for us to defend our public school system, because public education is a cornerstone foundation of our democratic civic society.
Wow, perfect timing.
You were a couple of seconds ahead of me there.
And
Yeah,
if you'd like a note on teachers' retirement and the money behind it, I can.
that would be great. So Peter, you want to address this private
Yeah, I just.
public thing, and then Mitzi can talk about teachers' pensions. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to just cite three different quotes. One is from our Constitution, 1777 Constitution, which reads, "Laws for the encouragement of virtue." It goes on to say, "A competent number of schools ought to be maintained in each town for the convenient instruction of youth." The next quote would be from John Dewey, Vermont's John Dewey, about 150 years later, which he said, "Democracy needs to be reborn every generation, and education is the midwife of democracy." And finally, recently Noam Chomsky gave a lecture series at Columbia, three different series of lectures at Columbia. And at the end, there were some questions from the audience, and a student asked him about education reform. And he said, "Education reform is a euphemism, quote, for the destruction of public education." Diane Ravitch recently visited this area and spoke down at in Hanover at Dartmouth, and she very much said the same thing. The first two quotes, I think, are how important education is to our culture and country in regards to our democracy and our well-being. And I think I definitely agree with Senator McCormick that some of these reforms are definitely aimed at sort of a consumer aspect of education, that we can pick and choose what we want for our own kids. And as Race to the Top alludes, there are winners and there are losers, and you can and losers are okay in today's world. Well, I fiercely object to that kind of, especially being on the Education Committee and being involved in education for 30 years in Vermont. I have a very strong feeling, and I think the tradition and basic tenets of Vermont have been very strong in equal access for all students.
Thank you. Mitzi, you want to talk about pensions?
Sure, just a quick note on teacher pensions. So the issue here that we're facing is that for the last 5 or 6 years or more, but those are the years that I've been aware of on the Appropriations, in my tenure on the Appropriations Committee, we've fully funded what actuarials have said we need to pay into both teacher and state employee retirement funds. The problem is that in the early 90s, those recommendations weren't necessarily followed, and which left us lagging behind. If you can picture your own retirement fund that perhaps when you were in your 20s and 30s didn't feel the need to put as much into as you maybe should have. And so that money didn't grow, and so it won't be there for you when you retire. So that's what the state is looking at, and Dick's absolutely right, that Senator McCormick is absolutely right, that it's future future taxpayers on the hook. The unique situation with the teachers' retirement fund is that in order to pay for teachers' health care in their retirement, which the state is also obligated to provide, that is paid out of the corpus of the fund. And so that money should really be coming from elsewhere, from a separate fund, which of course requires more money. So we're looking at this. Treasurer Beth Pierce has done an incredible job of laying out a variety of scenarios and how that impacts annual expenditures over the next 20 or 30 years, and what the accumulated liability is under these various scenarios were we to invest additional money on top of the actuarial recommendation. So we will be taking a good hard look at that this year.
So let me add a little to that. So as Mitzi said, we make the statutory recommendations, our actuarial recommendation to put the money in. And that rate this year is $72 million. And then immediately once we do that, we pay for the health care of retired teachers out of that. So, and we're the only state in the country that pays for the health care, or at least I know of. And I think if there is somebody else, there isn't hardly anybody else. So we pay for the health care right out of that. So the 72 million is what goes in, but the growth has been in teachers' retirement over the last 5 years, 16.4% a year. And this last year, 12.8% a year. So that gives you an idea. And the increase in healthcare, not just healthcare alone, because it's been paid out of there for a very long time, but that increase in healthcare does add to that overall increase in teachers' retirement costs. At the same time, our underfunding in the past is done.
Thank you, Rich. David, you wanted to say something?
Well, just briefly, when Ann introduced us, she mentioned one of the committees we're on. In the Senate, we're on 2 committees, so it makes sort of balance. 6 House members and 3 senators, and we have 6 committees on both sides covered. But I also serve on education under Ticka's chair. And one of the things I just wanted to mention with respect to the private school, public school issue is that as we discussed the issue of public dollars going to private schools, just a clarification, we were discussing that particularly around those private schools that are vast majority public dollars. It wasn't every single private school that had 1 pupil out of their 50, for instance. But the second piece was that in the discussion last year, we learned a lot about how potentially some of the public requirements would somehow make the private schools less able to meet some of the needs of their students, or the breadth of some of the creativity they have as teachers and so forth. And that really actually led me much more to a conclusion that we have far too many requirements on our public schools, and particularly those requirements stemming from No Child Left Behind, but even before that, really have yoked the both creativity and the sort of, for lack of a better word, the inspirational ability of our teachers to really be there to really open lights and doors and ideas for children, because they're so forced to teach to this faux accountability testing system that we have. And that's about, quote, accountability for your tax dollars, when in reality, I think in the end, it's actually hurting our school system and hurting what our teachers can offer to our youth. And so for me, as we look at education whether it's finance policy, requirements, and dollars, and what we're getting for our dollars, I actually want to look more at that and start turning back towards trusting our teachers and their inspirational ability and their teaching ability, and not creating so many hurdles for them on this, quote, accountability issue of our tax dollars, that we actually are getting less for our money.
Thank you. So anybody else want to talk about education? Or should we move on to net metering? Tony, are you ready? Should we have caps? Do we need limits? Should we get rid of the limits? What should we do about net metering?
Actually, I'd rather talk about the impacts of climate change and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions,
Okay.
which is probably, as we've heard the President of the United States down to our governor, to our Speaker of the House, that this is the #1 problem that we are facing, and the gap from stating the problem to doing anything about it is huge. And I don't mean any disrespect for anything that we've talked about so far today, but not one word about it so far today, and about the money problems that the state has on all sorts of levels. And the #1 problem that we have facing this state is impact on climate change, short-term and long-term. The hurricane that we went through, Hurricane Irene, to recover from that, I guess it's around $1 billion. Not one penny are we talking about doing anything about prevention. So I think it's going to be the job of the committee that I serve on is to begin closing the gap of recognizing what the problem is and then turning that into action. So now I'll get off the soapbox and I'll address the net metering question. Net metering is the most successful renewable energy program that we have ever had in the state. And in fact, in the last 2 years, it has just exploded in popularity. It's no longer that you walk down the street or drive your roads and you see a solar installation or a wind installation and go, oh my God, what's that? Or isn't that great? It is commonplace. And one of the biggest reasons that it is commonplace in the state of Vermont is our net metering program. And we have a good problem. We've had a number of our utilities have done a really, really good job, and they have reached the statutory ceiling of net metering. And so it is going to be the job, I hope, of the legislature to address that issue when we come back. And to that, the Department of Public Service has been working on this since the end of last session, has been meeting with our utilities and our renewable energy developers and our advocacy groups, and hopefully I believe that they are crafting a solution to the situation that will be acceptable to most, if not all, involved. And I expect that the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee will get that proposal, and that will be the first thing that this committee addresses when we get back.
Thank you, Tom. Kate, do you want to add to any of that, since I know you're in Fish and Wildlife, but your issues are connected, right?
Yeah, well, I would say that in terms of response to Irene, we certainly are doing quite a bit in terms of river management, or keeping us away from trying to manage our rivers. We are looking, in our committee, we are looking at some of the water impact on some of the wind sites. We've had testimony in that area, but I really don't have much more to add.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on. We're doing really well, gang. We've only been at this for about 40 minutes, and we're just cranking through the questions. David beforehand said, there's no way you're going to get through all those questions, but we're doing great.
We can talk more.
We've skipped some of them.
Well, we can always go back. Since we're on environmental issues to an extent, David, maybe you could talk about GMO labeling law, and then Mike will go on from there to talk about healthcare.
It's not that important.
I serve on the Agriculture Committee, as you mentioned from the beginning, and have worked on GMO issues for actually about 14 or 16 years, ever since I was first elected to the House. And for full disclosure, I'm also an organic vegetable farmer, so I have a little background in actual production as well. The House last year passed a fantastic bill relating to genetic engineering and labeling GMO foods. And my hope would be that in the Senate we'll take that bill up and pass a very similar version. The reality, I think, is that there will be a pretty big battle about this. It may or may not be fully in the legislature, but I suspect, given how the opponents to such legislation have worked in California and Washington State, spending nearly $70 million to defeat those referendums, that they will spend money in Vermont on our airwaves, TV, radio, etc. So just sort of a heads up to people that there may well be a lot of out-of-state dollars pumped into this issue, trying to get the public to pressure legislators maybe not to support a bill or to confuse the public around the legislation. And the legislation's pretty straightforward. It basically would say that foods that contain or may contain genetically modified ingredients, which are primarily from corn, soybean, cottonseed oil, canola oil, or beet sugar, would have to be labeled as such. And when you go to the store, it would have a little label on it that says so. As a consumer, you'd have every opportunity to choose to purchase that or not. There's no pro or con to it, but it would give consumers that information. The part that's going to be controversial about this legislation is what's called the trigger clause or the implementation clause. And in Maine and Connecticut, where they've passed similar legislation, they incorporated language that really gave up their state's autonomy. They said, we're going to pass this law, but it's only going to go into effect when 3 other states or 5 other states with a total population of 20 million people also pass the same legislation. We didn't do that with civil unions. We haven't done that with other legislation like single-payer health care. States should do what you want to do in your own state. And what the House did was very good legislation saying, we're going to implement this law on a date certain. I think it was January 2015. But if other states do it soon, then we'll do it even sooner. And I think where the battle is going to be is some members of the Senate, and I think out-of-state pressure will also push for delaying the implementation or creating this trigger that relies on what other states do. And we'll be debating that all the way through.
I actually, Mike, I was going to give you the mic next, but I realized that Kate wants to talk about GMO labeling, and while we're talking about environmental issues, there are actually a number of issues that perhaps Kate and Tony want to address that we haven't touched on yet, including shoreline protection bill, the total maximum daily load of phosphorus in the lake, pesticides. I have a question for Kate on pesticides. So maybe we'll do that, and then we'll leave the most controversial issue of the moment to the end. Okay, go Kate.
The question that often comes up with this bill is what are the risks that the state has for a potential lawsuit? I just need to remind folks that we have no specific threat from the biotech industry that we will be sued. However, there are 3 legal arguments on which the biotech industry or a producer, could actually come from a producer and not from the biotech industry, there are 3 potential legal arguments that they would have. We have crafted the bill such that we have created a bill that has been defined as being legally defensible to address all 3 of those issues. The Vermont Law School Law Clinic has found it legally defensible, as has the Oregon.
Don't worry about that.
Oh, it's healthcare. As has the Oregon Ledge Council. Now, no one is prepared to speak for what the courts will do, but we do have a bill that is legally defensible. In fact, when you look at the those who voted against the bill on the floor, Nobody was voting against it because they thought that we shouldn't have the right to label. They were voting against it because they were afraid of this lawsuit, potential lawsuit. As Senator Zuckerman was saying, the biotech industry spent $70 million trying to defeat this type of legislation. But when you think about it, the cost of actually fighting a lawsuit would be significantly less. So that while we are afraid that we might be sued, I would have to assume that the producers in biotech industry are also concerned. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending 10 times the amount of money to try to defeat this. And again, it's important to remember all of the reasons you might think that GMOs are fine. Nobody's saying that it can't be grown. We're simply looking for that right to know.
Sorry, just briefly to clarify, I think one thing that you meant by that they're concerned is that I think the biotech industry is concerned that they would lose the lawsuit.
Yes.
And that's why they would spend so much to defeat the law passing as a referendum in Washington or California, or potentially us passing a bill here. I think they're concerned that actually we do have legal standing to pass such a law. Why otherwise would they spend $70 million?
Thank you.
Thank you. Kate, would you like to address the Shorelands Protection Bill? And
Sure.
I also wondered if you could talk about Lake Champlain and the pressure the EPA is putting on the state to begin to really address the phosphorus problem.
It's water everywhere. As you probably know, the state was sued and lost a lawsuit brought by the Conservation Law Foundation requiring Lake Champlain, the TMDL, to be reviewed because we were not meeting the standards. We are expecting a new TMDL plan to be out at sometime in June. So there have been presentations around the state. I think 6 presentations recently completed. There are 2 things. I'm speaking about Lake Champlain first. So in response to this, the state has put forth a draft with recommendations as to changes and the amount of phosphorus that would be allowed. The pollution budget, a TMDL, total maximum daily load, refers to a pollution budget related to waters that are considered impaired by the Clean Water Act, of which Lake Champlain, the jewel of Vermont, is one. From this report, which you can find online, the state has made recommendations. In addition, our committee, the Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources Committee, met this fall, and we have a draft bill in place that will address a number of these issues. We're looking at a variety of things. We're looking at and this is the draft at this point. We're looking at agriculture, changes to agriculture. We're looking at bringing small farms in under regulation under the agency. We're looking at small farm certification. We're looking at becoming more serious and requiring livestock exclusion. Right now, we have incentives and technical support, but we would actually put that make that a law. We'd look at changes to manure spreading and certification programs. We'd look at tightening up stream alteration and removing some of the exemptions. And probably one of the biggest things that we're looking at is the creation of a water resources preservation program, which would provide funds and fees to help to create a fund of money that would be available for pollution-related or water quality issues on a number of bases. I expect this to be probably one of the more controversial aspects, but given that I think the recent report on what it would cost to clean up Lake Champlain is about $156 million a year. As Molly Beatty once said, if it isn't economic, if it isn't environmental, it isn't economic. And based on what we've been doing with our lakes and ponds and Lake Champlain, we're kind of loving them to death. And so our committee will be looking at this, and that's that. The other little piece is the Shorelands bill, which at one point in time everybody thought was the low-hanging fruit in terms of dealing with water quality. That turned out not to be the case. This was actually one of the least expensive things we could do to fund to improve and protect our shorelands and our lakes and ponds. I won't give you the details of the bill, but what I will tell you is where we are right now is the Shoreland Commission group, of which I was a member, traveled around the state. We had 6 meetings, 6 public hearings, and we received, I've forgotten how many comments, but a large number, 400 I think. All of those comments were in written form and can be found on the Department of Environmental Conservation website as well. In addition, there has been, they've all been sort of put into kind of an executive, more reasonably easy form. All of those comments have been addressed, and we will be, no, not we will be, the Senate is taking up the bill at this point. So we passed the bill in the House. It's now in the Senate. I would expect to see changes in that bill. It's possible that bill could be swept up into what we're doing with Lake Champlain. I don't know. It's in the hands of the Senate. Will be deliberating. I will expect something coming out of the Senate. I don't know what that form will be.
Thank you. Okay, we can't put this off any longer. Healthcare it is. Michael, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether or not the state should adopt a 1-year extension for the small business exchange mandate. That was a proposal that came from a couple of Republicans, including Don Turner and Senator Joe Benning. How should the state take stock of the rollout of the exchange? And what role will the legislature play in exploring financing options for single payer? Lastly, I have a question from a reader who wants to know whether or not the legislature will address medical billing issues and whether or not you guys can make it easier for consumers to estimate the cost of medical care. So a lot thrown at you. I can repeat those questions if you like.
So, and you don't want me to touch ACOs or?
Oh, well, maybe that could be round 2. Let's start with round 1.
I'm going to try standing.
Just more than 3 minutes. I mean, that's pretty lot.
Yeah,
So
we'll give you 5 or 6. Okay.
I have to start by recognizing whenever I'm in front of a crowd like this that when we're talking healthcare policy, a few things. One of them is that there's a bad illness. I don't know if it's a billable, code, something I get healthcare for, but there's an illness that happens to healthcare policy people where we start to speak in whole sentences and acronyms and nobody understands us. And so if that happens, the closest person next to me is going to have to start, throwing things at me. And then I also have to say, on the other side, when I'm not being a legislator, I'm a social worker in Addison County working with families that are often trying to get access to care. And it reminds me when we're having these conversations, and I can't even repeat the questions that just got asked of me, we often manage to talk about people without talking about people. We forget that at the core of this question, each and every one of us has in the back of our mind, what about me? Am I going to be able to get the care I need? Am I going to be able, or is my son or my grandmother going to be able to get the care that I need? And I just think it's important to say that up front, that we are talking about people, Vermonters, and Vermonters at some of their most stressed moments. So this has been a really tough couple of months. I'm sure, I don't think I could overstate it. It's been tremendously frustrating. It's been frustrating to Vermonters who are having that concern, what about me? It's been frustrating to policymakers such as myself. It's been frustrating to members of the administration. I'm sure it's been equally frustrating, or maybe more frustrating, to those people on the front line trying to make the darn thing work. We're spending 24/7, working nights and weekends, trying, contractors as well as state workers trying to make Vermont Connect work. It didn't work like we wanted it to work on October 1st. It doesn't work today like we want it to work, like we need it to work. Having said that, there has been tremendous improvements And the administration, along with our carriers, I have to do a shout out to our carriers who have done, have been great partners in this tough time, have created contingencies that really have protected Vermonters in a way that's very important. I am most concerned about people losing coverage, having lapses of coverage, and I'm equally concerned that people get the kinds of supports that they're eligible for. So as I look into the next legislative session and what is the legislature going to do, those are the motivating factors for me, is to minimize lapses in coverage and to make sure people get the kind of financial supports so that they can have access to care. Because it really all does come back to care. So I just want to say a few lines. It really has gotten better, and for those people who are hanging on the sidelines waiting for the website to work better, it's important to recognize that we have about 15,000 individuals and families who have signed up through Vermont Health Connect, and about 5,000 of them, about a third, if I have my math right, did it in the last week. I helped somebody sign up in the last couple of days. I've had people approach me on the street. I said this earlier today, and I didn't say part of the story. So I was walking down the street the other day, and this woman shouts at me across the street, and she says, "Well, I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you." And you know what I'm thinking? Oh man, someone else is going to be complaining to me about how bad the website is. And I'm hearing a lot of those things, and those are real. But she came across the street, she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, "I want you to know that I signed up the other day, and it went really well, and I'm going to save some money." And so I don't say that to minimize the bad stories. The bad stories are out there. There are some people who are continuing to have a real difficulty, but there are also people now, in the last couple of days, who are starting to, last couple of weeks or so, who are having a much easier time moving through the system. So there's also a great deal of concern about the small business community, and are they managing to get the kind of care that they need for their employees? And again, I think the administration did a good job of creating some contingencies. I know that it's been a stressful time for many of those small businesses, and I know that it will continue to be a stressful time. One of the things that surprised me that I didn't expect, even though I know I made the argument on the floor about the policies we passed, I didn't realize just how important employee choice was.
There is no choice.
That for employees who get a health benefit, that they have some choice about how they spend that benefit. And so, for instance, a woman came up to me the other day and said, "You know, I'm 23, and I know I have a $5,000 dependent child care bill. There's no question I have that child care bill for my son. But I don't know if I'm going to get sick, and I don't tend to get sick, and I'm willing to take the risk." And so the employee choice that we tried to build in, and that we're working on with the functionality exchange, would allow her to be able to buy a lower actuarial value plan, a plan that has a lower premium.
Those are all geek words
No, that's all right.
A plan that, thank you, a plan that's going to cost her less money in month-to-month bills, take a risk that if she gets sick, she'll have more out-of-pocket costs and be able to spend that money on taking care of her son.
So Mike, I hate to interrupt, but the duck has cracked twice, and you didn't really answer my question.
Politician not answering questions.
You didn't play by the rules, so I'm going to have to ask you again. How should the state take stock of the rollout of the exchange? If you could just answer that question, that would be great.
So I think I did.
You did?
I think I did, but I'll say again.
Not to my ears.
It has been a very frustrating time, and the measure that I'm going to continue to push for is making sure people don't lose coverage. And
already lost it. Answer the question.
And
how hard is it? Really?
I'm sorry, we can't have people shouting from the back of the room.
He's not going to answer the question.
Then please leave.
I'll be quiet.
So as we look at the contingencies that have been laid out and the proposals for changes, I'm going to measure them against making sure people have the coverage that they need, and making sure people that don't get access to the supports that are available to them. So when I hear a proposal like postponing the exchange, is that what it was, Ann?
Yeah, there was a proposal for a 1-year extension of current insurance.
I guess it's important for me to say that in the goal of minimizing people losing coverage, making sure people don't have lapses, everything, and I really mean it, everything is on the table for me. I'm willing to look at anything. But I do have to ask exactly, when I hear a 1-year delay in the exchange, it brings up a lot of questions of how you would do that while making sure that our carriers have the protection they need and making sure that Vermonters have protection they need in the rate review process.
Thank you for answering the question. So I believe it or not, we've gone through almost every question on the list. And so from here, not quite sure how to proceed. I don't know how thirsty you all are. And I'm sure you all are very thirsty. But we could ask a few more questions here, or we can just hang it up. So is there anybody in the panel who wanted to respond to anything that anyone said? Carolyn, you want to go?
Thank you. I just wanted to, following Mike's presentation, say that I really think that government's #1 job is to protect its people. And if our citizens in Vermont end up with no health care on the 1st of January or the end of March or a year from now, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. I have small businesses in my district and plenty of individuals who are so confused, it's unbelievable. And the question that Ann asked is what should Vermont's reaction be to the way this plan was all rolled out? One thing that I've looked at for quite a while is the shortcomings that CGI made when they missed dates time after time after time, going back quite a ways, but especially to May earlier this year. And it adds up to a lot of money. And that lack of meeting those deadlines is having an impact on all of my constituents and every Vermonter right now. That's why we're talking about extending it a year, or the governor's given us 3 months or however long. So this is why our constituents are confused. And I think that there should be some accountability.
Yeah.
So I'm anxious to see where the administration would like us to go, and also how much courage the legislature has to pick up on this.
If I could add something too, I looked at the website maybe a month or 6 weeks ago and didn't get very far. I wasn't really sure exactly what the plans were. I actually have not had health insurance, which is different than not having health care, by the way, for more or less the last 15 years. I'm one of those people at 42 who, through my 20s and 30s, played the gamble. And I've been on the lucky side of that. On the other hand, my spouse has Lyme disease. We signed her up for some coverage about a year ago. She still has pretty significant out-of-pocket costs with a $500 a month plan. And when I went back and started to look at it more recently, I called a navigator. And frankly, on my way down to the State House today, I gave some information to a navigator over the phone. About 20 minutes later, we talked again, and I had picked a plan and hung up again. And then about 10 minutes later, I've signed up. My wife, myself, and my daughter. So the process, either whether one completes it themselves, which I didn't, or whether one uses a navigator, which is very, very available to anybody who wants, is now moving much more smoothly. Our combined cost is actually less than my wife's plan as just her. We'll have very similar coverage. We do qualify for some federal subsidy. But I tell that story because I think it's really important, given the numbers that Representative Fisher talked about, as the website has improved and the enrollment process is improving. I think many people need to become more aware of that, because now I think some people aren't going to it because what they've heard, and it was factually true for a very long time, was that it was a very difficult process. But I think it's really important that folks look at that changing difficulty and work with navigators who can help with questions that people have to get through that. I fully agree with Representative Branagan and Representative Fisher that looking at how it happened, holding people accountable, the contractors, what else happened, sure, that's important, and we need to do that. But the most important thing is to get people covered looking forward. And I think a lot of people are working hard to make that happen.
Thank you.
I also agree with Representative Branagan. We definitely need to learn from this. Healthcare is not the only place where we've had a IT rollout with some difficulty, and I believe that this needs to be reviewed in a professional manner, and we need to really understand where each of the places where it fell down, where it didn't come together, and we need to learn from it. So I do support holding our contractors accountable to the extent that we can in the contracts we've created, and having a professional review feedback for the legislature.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment about anything that's been discussed?
If you're done with healthcare, I do have.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. Just a complete change of subject, but since we have a little bit of time, which is one of the main concerns of the Education Committee in the Senate is early education. Pre-K, we have a pre-K bill which has gotten through our committee and is now in the money committees, and we want to work very hard to get that. First of all, it's a good investment financially, but also it's good for kids, and also that the people who take care of very young kids really are educators of them and ought to have a right of collective bargaining. And that is an effort we have been very frustrated in advancing for several years. But this year, I think we're going to actually finally do something about that.
Great. Well, is it a wrap, folks? Thank you so much for coming tonight and for talking so earnestly with our crowd here. I appreciate your time. And I also want to thank our sponsors, AARP, Fletcher Allen Healthcare, Fairpoint, and for all of you coming. We'll have this on video tomorrow. And please, on your way out, well, first of all, there's a bar here, so if you want to pay cash for drinks and mingle with folks, go for it. We're also, we need to raise $24,000 for the end of the year, so if you're so inclined, we'd appreciate your donation. Thank you very much for coming.